Okay, today I'm going to present a contested war, the Nanking Massacre. December 17th in 1937 is a special day for many Chinese people. On that day, Japanese army invaded Nanking and committed a massacre. More than 200,000 or even 300,000 Chinese citizens and prisoners of the war were killed. About 200 Chinese women were raped by the Japanese, and one-third of the buildings in Nanking were burned by the Japanese army. However, with time passing, this history became contested and what really happened became controversial. In order to find out what really happened during the wartime, this presentation will examine the role that oral testimony of Chinese survivors of the Nanking Massacre have had in establishing factors about war crimes such as massacres of the citizens and the war rape. The first part will focus on what the oral testimony of survivors addressed. Then, the second part will discuss the role of oral testimony in different time periods. The power of the oral testimony and its applications will be demonstrated. However, even though most people agree with the fact that Japanese army did inhumanity crimes in Nanking, some people and scholars still refuse to acknowledge those crimes and neglect the long-term impact of gender violence. Thus, the last part of my presentation will tend to address those controversial issues. Oral testimony can be described as the oldest type of evidence. People's oral testimony directly reflect their personal memories, experience, and opinions. The major oral testimony analyzed in this presentation is from a survivor of the Nanking Massacre. The author of this narrative was Wen Sun-shi. His testimony was recorded when the subject was 82 years old. In her testimony, Wen Sun-shi said, "When the Japanese army entered Nanking in 1937, many citizens ran away and became refugees. Lots of refugees at Hutchinson International were killed by the Japanese army, and many female refugees, including the author herself, were raped by those Japanese soldiers." The author also remembered how Japanese army killed her neighborhood and her little cousin mercilessly. This testimony reflects how citizens in Nanking live under the fear of Japanese army and how they hate those inhuman Japanese soldiers. This testimony offered different views on difficult and often unimaginable situations people experienced during the Nanking Massacre and the collective violence. The language of this artifact was mostly descriptive. However, since it was based on author's own experience, it might be emotional to a certain extent. This artifact also includes survivors' memories of extreme acts of gender violence. In her memory, countless refugees at the internationally were raped and killed by those Japanese soldiers. The narrative not only told the audience about the past, but also the memory of the Nanking Massacre. To be more specific, this primary source concentrate on the gender violence issue. This primary source gave people more information about the gender violence during the Nanking Massacre. The author described herself as a victim of the gender violence and confirmed those extreme gender violence. This resource leads us to a more profound aspect of the war, the gender aspect. This testimony can be a starting point for studying the gender violence during the war, and it also can be a strong evidence for the testifier. At the same time, this source points out an important knowledge. In a war, the gender-based violence can be used as a weapon with the intention to demoralize and destabilize. Gender violence in the war actually are indigenous crime, and rape is a cheap and very effective weapon of the war. The gender violence is a significant role in the war and memory. After the war, the oral testimony of those survivors have been used as a powerful evidence to make a complaint against the Japanese army. In the Tokyo trial, the personal experience of the survivors was accepted as evidence on the court number 215. Also, a Chinese female survivor brought her testimony to the military court of the National Defense Department to expose the massacre of the Japanese army. Recently, the oral testimony gradually became an educational tool and had a profound significance. An oral history display dedicated to the Nanking Massacre survivors have been established at the Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall. The official website uses the oral testimony of the survivors to address the inhumanity war to the world and to educate the next generation. Also, the oral testimony as a strong evidence of the war has been added into the memory of the world by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The historical and cultural value of the oral testimony have been embodied. However, some people still try to ignore the existence of the massacre and neglect the long-term impact of the rape. But, according to her oral testimony, gender violence does cause long-term impacts. The survivor is 82 years old and her life still full of pain and suffering. She has to bear other people's prejudice even she is the person who has been hurt. Thus, oral testimony is really important. And the most important thing is people should face up to the history and take practical steps to find an effective way to resolve the issue via dialogue and consultations. So, the oral testimony of the survivors gave us a clear view on how Japanese army killed and raped innocent Nanking citizens. The oral testimony itself became a strong evidence during the war crime trials. At present, the oral testimony gradually become educational tool and show its historical and cultural value. So we cannot ignore the power of the oral testimony as it is the most direct reflection of the war. Well, that's the end of my presentation and thanks for your listening.